A man went down on the marble floor of the 30th floor lobby, and 41 people walked past him before one stopped. He had counted them later, every one. From the footage, 41. They stepped over his outstretched arm. They slowed, looked, and kept walking. One woman in heels actually said the word gross under her breath, and the microphones caught it. They thought he was a stranger who had fallen, a problem for somebody else, a stain on a morning that belonged to them. None of them knew that the man on the floor owned the building they were standing in, owned the company whose name was etched in steel above the security desk, owned, in one way or another, a piece of nearly every life that crossed that lobby. None of them knew they were being watched. None of them knew they were being measured. And the one person who stopped was the one person nobody in that building had ever bothered to learn the name of. Her name was Renata Mosley, and she was 52 years old, and she had been cleaning the floors of that tower for 9 years. Stay with me, because what happened to Renata that morning is the kind of thing that does not happen, the kind of thing you hear about and assume someone made up to make you feel better about the world. It was real, it was filmed, and it changed the whole shape of her life in a single afternoon. To understand the morning, though, you have to understand the man, and to understand the man you have to go back about a year, to a different floor, to a hospital room, where Gideon Vance learned something about himself that he did not like. Gideon was 61 years old, and he was worth a number that did not feel like money anymore, $4.3 billion. It had stopped being a sum he could picture and become a kind of weather he lived inside. He had built a logistics company out of a single lease truck and a stubbornness that bordered on cruelty, and over 30 years it had swallowed competitors and warehouses and whole shipping lanes until the name Vance meant something. In rooms Gideon would never enter. He had 3 homes and 1 private plane and a staff of people whose faces he mostly did not see. He was not a happy man. He would not have said he was an unhappy one either. He had simply stopped asking. Then his heart stopped asking too, on a Tuesday, in the back of a car on the way to a meeting he no longer remembered the point of. The doctors called it a cardiac event. He called it the day the floor opened. He woke up in a hospital bed with tubes in his arm and a monitor counting his pulse out loud. And for the first time in 3 decades, he was a body that needed help from strangers, and he could not pay his way out of it. What he noticed in that hospital, in the long flat days of recovery, was the people. Not the specialists who swept in for 90 seconds and swept out, the other ones. The nurse who turned him every 2 hours so his skin would not break down and who hummed while she did it, low, like she was not even aware she was doing it. The aide who brought his tray and said good morning like she meant it every single morning to a man who never once said it back. The woman who came at night to mop the floor and empty the bin, who he pretended to be asleep for, who he watched through half-closed eyes, wipe down the rail of his bed with a care nobody was paying her to give. These were the lowest paid people in the building. He knew that because he was a man who knew what everything cost. They were the ones who touched him, who saw him at his worst, who were kind to him when kindness bought them nothing. The nurse who hummed had a name on a badge he never read, and she would adjust his pillow with 2 quick practiced movements and tuck the blanket back over his cold feet and say, "There now," like he was a child, and he hated it and he waited for it. The aide who brought his tray was young, maybe 25, and she had a way of setting the cup of water exactly where his hand could reach it without stretching. Every time, a small attention nobody had taught her and nobody would ever thank her for. And the night woman with the mop moved through his room at 2 in the morning like she was trying not to wake a sleeping country, and one night when she thought he was under, she stopped at the foot of his bed and looked at the monitor counting his pulse, and she said, very softly, to a man she believed could not hear her, "Hang in there, mister. Whoever you are, hang in there." He had lain there with his eyes shut and his face turned to the wall, so she would not see that he was awake, and he had thought, who teaches a person to say that to a stranger at 2 in the morning? And it occurred to Gideon, lying there counting his own heartbeat, that he had spent his entire life surrounded by people who were kind to him because of what he could do for them, and he no longer had the faintest idea who among his own staff would be kind to him if he could do nothing for them at all. The thought would not leave him. It followed him home. It sat with him through the slow months of getting his strength back. And somewhere in those months, it hardened into a plan that a healthier, busier version of himself would have laughed at. He was going to find out. He told no one but Marcus, his head of security, a careful man of 48, who had been with him 11 years and who was the closest thing Gideon had to a friend, which is to say not very close at all. Marcus tried to talk him out of it. Marcus said it was undignified. Marcus said the lawyers would have a stroke. Gideon said he did not care and that he wanted the cameras running and that nobody was to be told. The plan was simple. On an ordinary Thursday morning during the busiest stretch of arrivals, Gideon would walk into the main lobby of his own headquarters, dressed not as himself, but as a tired older man in a worn coat and a knit cap, a man who looked like he had wandered in from the cold. And he would fall, he would go down on the floor and stay down, and he would see who in that river of his own employees stopped to help a stranger. They had no reason to help. He did not expect what he found. Nobody ever does. The morning came grey and hard, with a wind off the river that pushed people through the revolving doors with their collars up and their faces shut. Gideon stood across the street in his disguise, and his heart, the same heart that had nearly quit on him a year before, was hammering, and he almost did not do it. Then he crossed. He chose his spot in the center of the lobby between the security turnstiles and the bank of elevators where every single person on their way up had to pass. He let himself sway, he let his knees buckle, and he went down onto the cold marble with a sound that turned heads for half a second and then did not hold them. He lay there with his cheek against the floor and he watched the shoes. A pair of polished Oxfords slowed, then sped up. A pair of running shoes, a young man with earbuds in, stepped around him without breaking stride. As a livery courier with a box balanced on one shoulder glanced down, said "Sorry, buddy," to a man he thought was drunk, and went around. Two women in matching lanyards stopped 4 feet away, and one of them took out her phone, and for one foolish, hopeful second, Gideon thought she was calling for help, and then he understood she was filming, and that she would post it, and that her caption would be about a drunk in the lobby. The other one laughed. They walked on. An older executive he recognized, a vice president whose bonus he personally approved, paused, the longest of any of them. Long enough that Gideon's hope rose again, and then the man checked his watch and stepped wide around the body on his floor and was gone into the elevator. He had told himself he would feel nothing, that this was data, that he was a scientist of his own staff. He felt something. He felt it in his chest like a second heart attack, made of shame, not for himself, but for them, for all of them, for the building he had built that taught people to walk like this. 41, the number climbed. 41 people stepped over or around or past a man they believed to be dying on the floor, and not one of them knelt. And then, from the far side of the lobby, past the elevators, a cart with a squeaking wheel stopped squeaking. Renata had been wiping down the brass around the elevator call buttons, which was not her job exactly, but which she did because she could not stand a smudge on brass when she heard the soft, heavy sound of a person hitting the floor. She knew that sound. She had heard it before. At home, the year her mother was sick. And she turned and she saw the crowd part around something on the ground the way water parts around a rock, indifferent, already past it. And she saw a man down there, not moving, and she did not think about whether he mattered or whose problem he was. She left her cart where it stood, and she went to him fast, faster than a woman of 52 with a bad knee should have moved, and she got down on that cold marble in her grey uniform, and she put her hand on his shoulder. "Sir," she said. "Sir, can you hear me?" Gideon, with his eyes shut, felt a hand on his shoulder, and a second hand, warm and dry and certain, pressed flat against the side of his neck to find his pulse. He felt her lean close. He smelled the lemon of the floor cleaner, and underneath it something human and warm. "You're all right," she said low, not to the crowd. To him. "You're all right. I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." She did not have her phone out. She did not look up to see who was watching. She did not perform a single second of it. She just knelt there on the floor of a building full of people who had walked past him, and she held a stranger she believed to be dying, and she told him he was not alone. Renata had 3 children, grown now, and 4 grandchildren, and a one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city the people in that lobby drove through with their doors locked. She made just over $15 an hour. She had buried a husband and a sister and her mother, and she had been the one in the room for all 3. The one who held the hand, who said the words, who did the holding nobody else could stand to do. She knew what it was to be the only one who stopped. She had been doing it her whole life. It had never once occurred to her that it was rare. "What is your name?" she asked the man on the floor, because she knew from the year with her mother that you keep them talking, you give them their own name to hold on to. "Can you tell me your name?" "Stay with me. Now, help is coming." And Gideon Vance, 61 years old, $4.3 billion, lying on the floor of his own lobby in a stranger's coat, opened his eyes and looked up into the face of the one person who had stopped and found he could not say a single word. Marcus was already moving. He had been watching from the security desk the whole time, sick to his stomach, counting the same 41 Gideon was counting, and the moment the cleaner went down on her knees, he had a real crew of 2 real medics, who had been waiting in a back office the whole morning, crossing the lobby at a run with a real gurney. The crowd, which had not stopped for a dying man, stopped now for the spectacle of medics, and a ring of phones came up, and Renata, still kneeling, still holding the stranger's hand, looked up at the running medics with relief flooding her tired face and said, thank God, he's breathing, his pulse is steady, he just needs help." She did not know. She had already given him all the help that mattered. They lifted him onto the gurney. Renata stood up, her knee screaming, and she stepped back to let the professionals work. And a younger custodian named Theo, who had come over at the commotion, took her elbow and whispered, "Miss Renata, that was something," and she waved it off, embarrassed, and said anybody would have, and went to find her cart. She was already worrying that she had left it in the walkway. She was already thinking about the brass she had not finished. She mopped up the wet spot where the man had lain, so nobody else would slip, and she pushed her cart toward the service elevator, and her shift went on. She had no idea who she had just held. She had no idea her whole life had just turned over on a hinge, while she worried about a smudge on brass. And if you have ever been the only one who stopped, the only one who stayed, the only one who did the hard kind thing, while everyone else found a reason to keep walking, then you already know the part Renata knew, which is that you do not do it for what it gives you. You do it because you could not live with yourself if you did the other thing. Hold that. We are coming back to it. Marcus found Gideon in the back office 20 minutes later, the worn coat thrown over a chair, the knit cap on the desk, the billionaire sitting very still with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. Marcus had braced himself for fury. For the cold, quiet rage Gideon turned on people who failed him. He had not braced himself for this. When Gideon looked up, his eyes were red. 41, Gideon said. 41 of my own people. One stopped, Marcus said. I know, Gideon said. I know exactly who stopped. He had her file by noon. There was almost nothing in it, because the people who clean the floors do not generate much of a file. A name. A start date 9 years back. A pay rate that made Gideon flinch when he saw it next to the numbers he signed without reading every day. An address, an emergency contact, a daughter, Camille. A note from a supervisor 3 years old that said only, reliable, keeps to herself, no complaints. 9 years of a person's working life, and the company that employed her had written 11 words about her. Gideon read those 11 words 4 times. Then he put the file down and looked out the window at the grey river and thought about the nurse who hummed and the aide who said good morning and the woman who mopped his hospital floor while he pretended to sleep, and he understood that he had spent a year and a great deal of theatre to learn a thing those women could have told him in a sentence. The people the world overlooks are not overlooked because they have less to offer. They are overlooked because the world has trained itself not to look. He did not call Renata to his office. He thought about it, and something stopped him. An instinct that to summon her like that, to make her stand on the carpet in front of the desk and be thanked, would be its own small cruelty, would make the kindness into a transaction after the fact, would put her in his debt for something she had done freely. He did not want to put her in his debt, he wanted to understand what he owed. So he did something he had not done in 11 years. He went down. He took the service elevator, the one he had never once ridden, down to the sub-basement where the custodial staff had their break room, a windowless room with a long table and a coffee maker and a corkboard layered with notices nobody read. It was a little after 7 that evening. The day shift was clocking out and the night shift had not yet filled in, and there were 4 people in the room, and one of them was Renata, eating a sandwich she had brought from home out of a folded paper bag she would flatten and reuse. The room went silent when the doors opened and Gideon stepped out. They knew his face. Everyone in the building knew his face. A man in a $4,000 suit did not come to the sub-basement ever, and for a 6-second the whole room assumed someone was being fired. Gideon looked at the 4 of them and felt absurdly afraid. He was a man who walked into boardrooms like he owned them because he did. And here in a break room that smelled of burned coffee and bleach, he did not know where to put his hands. "Mrs. Mosley," he said. Renata stood up. She wiped her mouth with a napkin and set down her sandwich and stood up straight, the way you stand when you think trouble has finally come for you, and she said, "Yes, sir, that's me," in a steady voice that did not show the lurch of fear underneath it. This morning, Gideon said in the lobby. The man who fell stopped. He had rehearsed this and the rehearsal was gone. "That was me," he said. Renata looked at him, the other 3 looked at him, and Renata, who was quicker than her file, who had spent 52 years reading rooms because reading rooms was a survival skill where she came from, looked at this man's face and saw something in it she had seen before, in hospital rooms, on the faces of people who had just been handed the truth about themselves, and she understood most of it in one breath. "You weren't sick," she said, quiet. "It was a test." "It was a test," Gideon said. "And nobody stopped," Renata said. "Not the part about herself. The part about them." Her voice, when she said it, was not angry. It was sad. "All those people," she said, and her eyes went over his shoulder to the corkboard and the notices nobody read, and she said, "They're scared, you know. Most of them. Scared of being late, scared of the one above them, scared of losing the little they've got. It makes a person walk fast. It doesn't make them bad." Gideon had built a $4 billion empire on his ability to assess people in seconds, and he had been wrong about nearly everyone. And here was a woman making $15 an hour explaining to him, gently, that the staff who had failed his test were not villains, but frightened people in a frightened building, and that the building was his. "You stopped," he said. "I heard somebody hit the floor," Renata said. Like that explained everything, and to her it did. He asked if he could sit. She said it was his building, he could do what he liked, and there was the faintest dry edge to it. Not disrespect, just truth, and it made him almost smile for the first time, in longer than he could remember. He pulled out a chair at the long table and sat down among the custodial staff of his own company, and for the next hour, while the night shift trickled in, and stared and pretended not to listen, Gideon asked Renata about her life, and she told him, plainly, without asking for anything, because he had asked, and because she was tired, and because some part of her had decided this strange evening was a thing happening to someone else. She told him about the 3 children and the 4 grandchildren. She told him about Camille, the oldest, who was smart, smarter than the schools around them ever had time for, who had wanted to be a nurse since she was 9 years old, and who had gotten into a program, a good one, and who was carrying so much debt to pay for it, that Renata lay awake doing the math some nights, the math of how many extra shifts, how many years before her girl could breathe. She did the math out loud for him, right there at the long table, because he had asked and because numbers were a language they both happened to speak. "So much a month," she said, "for so many years. And that is, nothing breaks, if the car holds, if the knee holds, if nobody gets sick, and something always breaks." She said it the way you would describe a long walk in bad weather, not asking him to carry her, just telling him the distance. She told him about the apartment, the radiator that knocked all winter, the upstairs neighbor's baby. She had come to know by its cry. She told him about the knee she needed to get looked at and kept not getting looked at because the looking cost money she did not have, and she robbed it without seeming to notice she was doing it the way a person robs a thing that has hurt for so long it has become part of the furniture of the body. She did not tell it as a complaint, she told it as a weather report, the way people tell you about the conditions they have learned to walk through. And she told him because he asked about her mother. The year of holding the hand, the smell of the room, the 3 in the morning hours when the building was asleep and it was just the two of them and the slow machine of dying. The thing she had learned in that year, which was that the worst part of dying was not the pain, it was the being walked past, the being treated like a problem in a bed instead of a person in a life, and that she had promised herself, kneeling by her mother's bed at 3 in the morning with her mother's hand going light in hers, that she would never walk past anybody, that she would always stop, that whatever else her life was, it would have that in it. That's why, she said. That's why, this morning. You want to know why I stopped, and they didn't. That's the whole reason. I made a promise to a woman who's gone, and I keep it because she can't check on me, which is exactly when a promise counts. Gideon went up to his office that night and did not go home. He sat in the dark with the grey river going black under the city lights, and he thought about a ledger, because he was a man who thought in ledgers, and he saw with the awful clarity of a man who has nearly died and learned nothing, and then learned everything, that he had spent his life on the wrong side of it. He had taken and called it building, and a woman 3 floors down had given and called it nothing. Just a promise kept, just stopping when she heard somebody fall. He did not sleep. By morning, he knew what he was going to do, and he knew how to do it so it would not crush her, so it would not turn her grace into his charity, so it would land as what it was, which was not a reward and not a payment, but a correction. A setting right of a ledger that had been wrong for a long time. He started with the thing she had not asked for, and would never have asked for, because it was not for her. He had his office find Camille's program, her loans, the exact and humiliating arithmetic of them, and he paid them. All of them. Not as a gift to Renata. As an investment, the paperwork said, in a future nurse, the kind of person who would someday kneel on a cold floor for a stranger because that was who her mother had raised her to be. He had the letter written so that Camille would understand it was hers, earned by her own work and her own promise, and that her mother had not begged for it, had not even known. That was the quiet part, though, and Gideon understood that the lobby had been public and the correction had to be public too, because 41 people had walked past and a whole building had learned the wrong lesson, and you do not fix a thing in secret that was broken in front of everyone. So 3 weeks later, on a Friday, he called an all-staff meeting in the lobby, the same lobby he had the footage ready. And he stood up in front of nearly 400 employees, the executives in front, the custodial staff at the back, where they always stood, and he told them the truth. He told them a man had fallen in that lobby 3 weeks ago. He told them it had been him. He watched the faces change, watched the 2 women with the lanyards go white, watched the young man with the earbuds, who was here, who was always going to remember this, drop his eyes to the floor. He did not name them. He did not have to. He said 41 people had walked past a man they believed was dying, and that he was not telling them this to shame them, though some of them felt shame and that was theirs to carry, but to tell them what he had learned lying on that floor. Then he asked Renata to come up from the back. She did not want to. Camille was standing beside her, because Gideon had quietly made sure she would be there, and Camille put a hand on her mother's back and said, "Go on, Mama," and Renata walked up the length of that lobby in her grey uniform past the executives in their suits to stand beside the man whose life she had not saved, but whose soul, he would have said, if he were a man who used that word, she maybe had. He did not make a speech about her, he had learned that much. He just told them what she had done plainly. The kneeling, the hand on the neck, the "I'm not going anywhere." He told them she made $15 an hour and had worked in that building for 9 years, and that the company that employed her had written 11 words about her in 9 years, and that this was the failure, his failure, the building's failure. Not the failure of 41 frightened people, but the failure of the man who had built a place where people learned to be afraid instead of kind. And then he set the ledger right in front of everyone. He announced that Renata Mosley was, as of that morning, the director of a new thing, a thing he was inventing on the spot because it should have existed all along, a staff care office with a real salary, a real title, and one job, which was to make sure that every person in that building who emptied the bins and mopped the floors and turned the patients and brought the trays was seen, was known, had a name in a file longer than 11 words. He announced that the lowest pay rate in the company was being raised that quarter and that he had Renata to thank for the number because she had told him in a break room what fear does to a person who is one missed shift from the edge. The lobby was very quiet. Renata stood there with her hands folded in front of her, not gloating, not weeping yet, just standing dignified the way she had stood when she thought she was being fired, and she looked out at 400 faces and found her daughters, and that was when her eyes filled. Gideon turned to her, in front of all of them, and he did the thing he had not done in the hospital, the thing he had not done to the nurse who hummed or the aide who said good morning every day, to a man who never answered. He said thank you out loud to a woman who cleaned floors. And then, more quietly, so that only the front rows heard it, he said, "You told me help was coming. You were right. It just came slow, and it came for the wrong person first." Renata did not have a speech either. She looked at him, and she looked at the lobby, the same marble where she had knelt, and she said, the only thing that was in her, which was, "I just heard somebody fall. That's all I ever did. I heard somebody fall, and I couldn't walk past. It became the thing the building remembered, not the test, the answer. Here is what I want you to sit with before we get to the rest, because the rest is good and you deserve it." Renata did not stop because she knew who he was. That is the whole thing. She stopped when he was nobody, a stranger in a worn coat, a problem on the floor, the exact kind of person a building full of frightened people had been trained to step over. She gave him everything she had, which was a warm hand and a steady voice and a promise that he was not alone, before she had any idea there was anything to gain. The reward came after, and the reward was real, but the reward is not the point, and it was never the point. The point is who she was when she thought no one who mattered was watching. Somebody was always watching. Somebody always is. The months after did not go the way Renata braced for. She had braced in her bones for the catch, because in her life there had always been a catch. There was no catch. The salary was real, and it cleared every 2 weeks. The title was real, and it came with a small office that had a window, an actual window. The first window she had ever worked beside in 9 years underground. Camille's letter came, and Camille called her mother in tears at 11 at night to read it to her, the words about a future nurse, the words about a promise kept, and Renata sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to her daughter cry the good kind of crying, and understood that the thing she had carried up from her mother's deathbed had finally been set down somewhere safe. She was good at the job. Of course she was. She had been doing the job her whole life without the title. She learned every name on the custodial and food and patient care staff, all 112 of them, and she put real things in their files: the daughter in the nursing program, the son back from the service, the surgery somebody was scared of, the English class somebody was taking at night. There was a man named Reggie on the loading side who had not spoken 3 words to anyone in 2 years, and Renata sat with him in that same break room with 2 coffees until she learned he had lost a boy. And after that, Reggie talked to her, only to her at first, and then to others. There was a woman named Joy who cleaned the surgical floor and who flinched every time a supervisor passed, and Renata learned it was because, at her last job, a supervisor had cost her everything over a thing that was not her fault. And Renata walked Joy to the right office and stood beside her while she told it, so she would not have to tell it alone. She caught a woman 3 weeks from eviction and got her to the right desk before the edge. She caught a young man who had stopped eating lunch to save money, who she found one afternoon sitting in the break room with nothing in front of him while everyone else ate, and she made sure, quietly, with no fuss and no audience, that he ate and that he kept eating, and that he never knew exactly how. She did for a building of frightened people the thing she had done for a stranger on the floor. She stopped and she stayed, and she made it so the building stopped too. Gideon changed. In the smaller, harder way that older men change, which is not all at once and not completely, but really, in the places that count. He learned the names of the people who touched his life. He said good morning and meant it, and waited for the answer. He never again signed a number he had not read. He and Renata did not become friends exactly. The gap was too wide, and they both knew it. But twice a year, on the anniversary of the fall and on the anniversary of his own near death, the year before it, he came down to her office with 2 coffees and sat in the chair by her window, and they talked. 2 people who had each, in their own way, walked past by the world and decided not to walk past anyone else. The knee got fixed. That was an early thing, almost the first thing, on the company's insurance. That was real now too. She walked without the catch in her step for the first time in years, and the first place she walked easy and even was up the length of that lobby, across the marble, on her way to the small office with the window, past the security desk where the footage of 41 people was kept and would be kept. Gideon insisted not to shame anyone, but to remember. Camille graduated in the spring. She stood in a gown the color of a deep evening sky and crossed a stage and became a nurse, and in the second row her mother sat in a dress she had bought new, not borrowed, not from the back of a closet, new, with the tags cut off that morning at the kitchen table, and watched her girl take the thing she had wanted since she was 9. And there was no math running underneath it anymore. There was just a mother watching a daughter, free of the weight, and somewhere in that room there was a 62-year-old man who had quietly bought a ticket and sat in the back and slipped out before the end, because he had learned, finally, that the best thing you can do for a person is sometimes to give them the moment and stay out of the frame of it. Renata kept the paper bag. The folded one from the morning of the fall, the one she had eaten her home sandwich out of in the break room when a billionaire walked in and turned her life over. She did not know why she kept it. She flattened it that night the way she always did, and she put it in the drawer of the desk in her new office, the one by the window, and now and then, when a day was hard, when somebody in the building was 3 weeks from the edge and she was tired, and the old fear that there had to be a catch came creeping back, she would open the drawer and look at the soft, worn paper of that bag, and she would remember the woman she had been on, the morning she had nothing, who knelt on a cold floor for a stranger because she had heard somebody fall and could not, would not, walk past. That was who she had always been. The title did not make her that. The salary did not make her that. The fall did not make her that. It only let the rest of the world finally see what her mother had seen, what a dying man on a marble floor had felt in the warm, certain press of her hand, what a building full of frightened people learned to want to be. She had heard somebody fall. She had not walked past. And the whole long ledger of her life, every shift, every hand held in every dark room, every promise kept when no one was checking, came back to her that morning in a worn coat on a cold floor, and it has never stopped coming back since. If you have ever been the only one who stopped, tell me about it, because I think the world has more Renatas in it than it lets on, and they almost never get the lobby and the window and the daughter free of the weight, and I would like, just for a moment, to imagine that they all do. And if this story moved you, there is another one waiting, about a man who returned a wallet with $900 in it on the worst night of his life, and what was folded behind the cash that he did not find until morning. Stay close. There is always somebody falling. Be the one who stops.